Joining us now is Fox News digital columnist David Marcus. What's up, David?
Hey, Will, how you doing?
I'm good. Good to see you here today, rocking your Nottingham Forest jersey. Not many Fox News hosts are going to be able to spot that right
That's
off
well
the bat.
done.
But you found the one that can spot a Nottingham Forest jersey.
Yeah, it's a good job. And it doesn't have the 2 stars because this is the 1977 jersey, so they hadn't won the 2 European Cups yet. They were about to.
Now, why are you a fan of Nottingham?
Brian Clough, he was their coach. He's known as the greatest coach England never had. There's a great movie called The Damned United about him. And he's just a great character. My favorite Brian Clough quote, he said, I wouldn't say that I'm the best manager in football, but I'm in the top 1. And I just think that's a good attitude for life, you know.
It reminds me of Senator John Kennedy the other day saying, I'm not going to say he's the dumbest man in the world, but he better hope the dumbest man in the world doesn't die. We can do math either way. Yeah. I saw Damned United. It's a damned good movie.
Isn't it? Yeah. Cole Meany's great in it.
I think of him as Leeds. I forgot that he was Nottingham, but I like that you have. I mean, I'm a glory hound. I'm a Big Six kind of guy. I'm a Manchester City fan, so good on you for kind of going as a deep cut. That's how I read you anyway, David. Like, you would never be the guy that likes, top 40 pop music. You're the guy that's got some garage band in Brooklyn you've been listening to since 1978. Like,
several. I'll tell you a funny quick story about.
You're like, I liked Green Day before they were Green Day.
Right. No, I'll tell you a soccer jersey story though. I was in Tel Aviv, and to your point, I had gone. When I travel abroad, I like to buy a soccer jersey from the place that I'm at. I wanted to get the Israel jersey, but they didn't have one. So I'm at the Adidas store, and I knew Maccabi Haifa is like the Yankees, and so I didn't want that. So I'm going through. I find this jersey. It's a Tel Aviv team. It's red. I'm like, okay, this is cool. Get back to the hotel, put it on. I'm walking down the beach. People are staring at me, like really giving me these nasty looks. And I'm like, what's going on? So I take my phone out. I Google the team. It's Hapoel Tel Aviv, which is the pro-Hamas, pro-Antifa communist soccer team. And I'm just walking around and I just got back, like took it off. I had no idea. I wear it in West Virginia. Nobody knows. Wow, but yeah, man. It was weird.
You should have Googled that before the purchase.
Well, now I know.
I do find that fascinating. I do find that fascinating about soccer. We've talked about it with the guys here on the show, how they're not just teams. It's not like being a fan of the Dallas Cowboys or the Denver Broncos. You're signing up for history, and in many cases, you're signing up for politics. Like, you like Lazio in Rome, that means something versus you liking Roma, and it means something about your politics. Same thing with Real Madrid and Barcelona. Those are more popular globally franchises that you can get the casual fan that just likes, Messi versus Ronaldo. But it means something in Spain about your politics. And I think that's fascinating to research and understand. And even though I don't want the world to be political, and I think sports is a great outlet for a non-political angle to culture, there's part of me that also kind of just likes deeper meaning to fandom.
Yeah, although I think we maybe dodged a bullet with our sports teams not having those kinds of political affiliations, probably just because of the way that the leagues grew up. And I think you might even say the bottom line in American sports leagues was always money, right? Like for the league itself, and for the fan, it was allegiance to place, right? So, and even though we have New York where you might have 2 teams, right? And even Philly had 2 baseball teams back in the day, right? The A's were there. We didn't have situations like London or Buenos Aires where there's 9 teams. And I think that fed into it as well, where, who you supported out of 9 teams would more likely have a political meaning to it. But I'm glad we don't have it. I have plenty of reasons to hate the Cowboys without, politics being involved.
That's a good story, though, about you buying the pro-Hamas jersey and walking down a beach in Israel.
All right, in my closet.
A little more, but only slightly more socially acceptable might be what Jim Acosta has just done at his new Substack. He has interviewed Joaquin Oliver, who died in the Parkland school shooting. How did he do so? He did so with AI. Watch.
I would like to know what your solution would be for gun violence. Great question. I believe in a mix of stronger gun control laws, mental health support, and community engagement. We need to create safe spaces for conversations and connections, making sure everyone feels seen and heard. It's about building a culture of kindness and understanding. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea, Joaquin.
All right. Let's start here, David, before we dive in.
Mm-hmm.
Man, it's getting really good. It is really incredible what AI is doing and can do and will do. And still so far, still so much in its infancy. And, you know, you could see it in that clip. Like I think you can tell that is AI, but you have to really kind of look. Like it's in the eyes. There's something in the face that is honestly not quite alive. You can see it on Instagram if you ever go to your search. And for some reason, I don't know why, but you'd be getting pictures of Instagram models. You can see which ones are AI and which ones are real. But we're getting there fast, David.
Yeah, I'm deeply troubled by a lot of aspects of AI, even though I don't believe it's real or possible. I don't think the concept of a machine that thinks in the way that a human being thinks is possible at all. It reminds me very much of the biblical story of the Library of Babel. And in both cases, I think that a lot of the results could be, kind of negative. My big fear regarding AI and this stuff is that the big tech guys are going to try to convince us that they've created reality or they've created actual thinking, not by raising machines to the level of human thought, but by lowering what we think human thought is to the level of what machines are capable of doing. And this was when Pope Leo was elected, the very first column I wrote about him, I said his biggest challenge is going to be AI, because in a kind of epistemological way, it challenges our deepest connection to what you say reality, right? The unalive nature of these things that we're interacting with, almost like golems, right? So that's scary stuff. But I think even just on a more basic journalistic level, this makes no sense to me. I mean, my first thought when I saw this was like, oh, this is great. Let's make an AI of JFK and ask him if he saw anything on the grassy knoll, right? I mean, it doesn't even, it brings nothing but emotional manipulation. So I can't understand why this would be remotely purposeful or useful for any journalist other than to try to, again, emotionally manipulate people.
Totally agree. I mean, we should say Jim Acosta wasn't trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. I mean, this was something that he did, acknowledging to his audience that this is what he is doing. But what is the point, as you highlight? What is the point? What is journalistic about interviewing an AI, not just character, but an AI victim of a mass shooting, who then is going to forward opinions that kid did not have? Or if he did have, is most likely unknown to us. Maybe his parents said, these are the kind of thoughts that Joaquin was saying before he was lost. But it's not real. People change. People evolve. People think. People experience. And you've created this falsehood. And I think it's incredibly gross from Jim Acosta.
It's frightening.
And no surprise, by the way, David, no surprise. You know,
no, and it's everywhere.
I'll tell you this.
Teenagers having relationships with ChatGPT, man. It's creepy.
Well, okay, I want to come to that in a second.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is I've heard through the media lunchroom counter gossip, Jim Acosta will do whatever he needs to do for relevance and fame. So in a way, he's AI. In a way, he's not a real person. He'll be the most anti-Trump guy if the climate from 2015 to 2024 is that the most anti-Trump guy gets the most airtime on CNN, gets the most fame. But if the climate changes and he needs to be someone else in order to maintain airtime and relevance, he'll be that. And here today, now that he's on his own, he's got to find the most radical or innovative or grotesque thing to do to maintain that airtime and that relevance. I guess I kind of sit here and think, in the end, and Jim Acosta is AI.
I take your point, because AI, when you think about AI, it's like, okay, you're going to put an input in and you're going to have no control over what happens in the black box, and what comes out is going to be what comes out. And that is how a lot of the leftist media operates, right? Like my current favorite one is like everything that's happening in the world, from Russiagate to Sydney Sweeney to whatever it is, the leftist media has convinced themselves this is all just to distract from Epstein, right? Like, the Phillies game is to distract from Epstein. And they just made this up in their head. And now they say it as if it's an established fact. It's very, very strange.
Yeah, I think the prompt on Jim Acosta is, the AI prompt is, keep me in the conversation. What should I put on my Substack? Like, that is the AI prompt. And by the way, we've had this conversation on several occasions. I wouldn't be surprised. Watch. I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, Acosta becomes someone who is willing to be more open to Donald Trump. If the culture and the conversation continues to move in that direction, and the line of CNN late night and MSNBC continues to fractionalize itself into a small minority, that won't be the path to relevance. So watch a guy like Acosta move in the direction of saying something you're like, wow. And then we'll be tempted on Fox to play it like we've done with Bill Maher, go, wow, even Jim Acosta. But I'm pretty skeptical, David. I always want to be somebody who's open to people changing their mind. But, we've seen a host of characters lose their position on mainstream outlets like Chris Cuomo, who now all of a sudden is willing to admit, I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. That's a clip that's going around right now. And it's an interesting admission from Chris Cuomo. But it's hard to separate that from what a lot of people are doing once they no longer work for the corporation. Is it because they no longer have to appease their bosses? Or more cynically, they're sitting there going, what plays and what keeps me relevant?
I mean, I look at it a little less cynically, I think, than you do. Maybe it's just my rosy, optimistic nature. But so, for example, like it's Terry Moran, right? Like he's one of these guys who's sort of exiled from ABC, and now he's doing his thing. And I don't know if it was a Substack. It was something I saw Mark Halperin share yesterday or the day before, where he is doing some soul searching, right? And he's writing in his thing like,
yes,
there's ideas out in this country that aren't being represented because those voices aren't in the newsroom. And for me, and in particular for the style of journalism that I do, that is something that I like to hear, right? And I'm glad, whether they're going to change or not, I'm glad that that's at least a part of the conversation, because it's true. And it's actually a little worse because the people from the rest of the country who end up in the newsrooms in New York and DC, they are the people who left because they don't particularly like where they came from. So it's almost a double whammy. It's like, it's not just you're not being represented, it's you're being represented by the people who go to brunch in Brooklyn and tell horror stories about their horrible hometown in Oklahoma.
That's
and how backwards
right.
and racist. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, you have the people that grew up in the bubble and really only have exposure to that New York, D.C., Los Angeles world, or you have the people that have come from my world, come from your world, who for some reason feel jilted by it or hate it in some way, and then move off to New York or D.C. and then report on it in a negative fashion. What you're talking about is Terry Moran recently said that the newsrooms, he said something that we all know, the newsrooms have no viewpoint diversity whatsoever. And when they try to get newspoint diversity and go out into the world like you do, David Marcus, they do it almost anthropologically, like going to the zoo. And he said something like, you can see a tiger in a zoo, but it's not the same thing. It's a version of a tiger. And that's exactly what they do. They'll go back to Oklahoma and then treat everyone there as though, they're talking about their roof being blown off by the tornado in every occasion. It's that same sort of leering, almost mocking, but more condescending view of America.
Yeah, and not understanding what makes those places tick. I put an interesting poll up on X recently where I asked people, how often in a given month do you bump into someone at the grocery store who you knew when you were in high school? And I mean, basically everyone said zero, right? But there were a few people who were like, 2 or 3 times, right? Because when you live in a town that's 20, 30, 40,000 people, you do see that. And there is this level of connection that I think the urban newsrooms don't have a real sense of, especially since like, and I hadn't really thought of this before, but like cities don't have them the way they used to. When I was growing up in Philly, our neighborhoods were very distinct and you knew what they meant and that you represented them. And even that in cities like Philly and New York, like those are all in flux and changing. And that sense of being rooted to land is not something that people in New York newsrooms have a good understanding of.
All right, one more thing on this AI. I hear how skeptical you are of it, and I appreciate that because, like you said, this interview that was done by Acosta really is of no value other than emotional manipulation. But the guys on the show were talking with me on the phone this morning, and they were like, Will, think about how many thousands of hours of content you have publicly available and digitized. And with the furtherance of AI, like my sons or my grandchildren could theoretically have full access to that, not to watch, but have it synthesized and rebroadcast back to them in a tailored fashion. So in other words, I wonder what my dad would say to this. And there'll be some AI version that analyzes all of my opinions that I've put out for decades and be able to synthesize some type of perhaps likely opinion that I would have given to them in any given situation. And that's kind of interesting, David. And I said in return, you know what, though? It won't only be a public figure like me with all of this content, because as we have like meta glasses and everything else recording our every thought, our every vision, social media, you'd kind of be able to do that with anybody. You'd be able to like go back and say, I wonder what my grandfather would have done in this situation. And you'll get some AI kickback, perhaps a hologram, perhaps some humanoid version of it that's going to tell you. And I think that's one of the things that occurs to me in looking at this interview with Acosta.
Yeah, I find that entire idea absolutely horrifying. To me again, like it is replacing something that is real and that is true with something that feels real and feels true, but isn't. And the more that we let ourselves do that, I mean, look, man, I mean it's like literally what Satan does, right? This is why we say the prayer to Saint Michael to defend us from these things that appear real, but actually aren't. With regard to what you're talking about, though, about this mass of, all of our lives, there's all this data, there's all this stuff. It always reminds me, there's a wonderful short story by Jorge Luis Borges called The Library of Babel. And in it, he imagines a library, there's a language, 25 letters, 2 punctuation marks. And in this library is every possible combination of these letters that could ever exist. So there is a book with the true account of your death. There's also infinite books almost of false accounts, right? Everything that could be expressed is in this library. The question is, how do you get to it? The question is, how do you find it? And you can't destroy anything, because if you destroy one book, there's an exact copy of it that's only different by one letter. And Borges, it's worth reading. It's short. Borges sort of explores this. And ultimately, it still has to come down to human beings making choices.
It is going to be absolutely fascinating. I don't think it just feels true. The only thing we're going to have to account for is there is some probability that it is also true, because it is algorithmically based on things that you have said in the past. And so it would have some, while it cannot be absolutely true, it would have some measure of probability that the real person would have given that similar advice or feedback. And that's going to be very, very complicated. David Marcus has 2 columns up at foxnews.com that have caught my attention, one of which we spoke about last week on the Will Cain Show. David wrote about the homeless situation on the streets across America, cities like Austin or Seattle, but not just those, Dallas, New York. Everywhere across America, you've seen this rising tide of homelessness, and it's really awful. And David, you and I spoke about the fact that very, very few of this rising population of homeless are what exists in our mind about homelessness. I think what exists in our mind, what exists in a child's mind, is someone who's fallen on hard times. A mom and her kids, or a guy without work who has fallen on hard times. And very few people actually fit that profile. The vast majority make up one of other 2 categories, and that is drug addicts and people who have mental illness, who in a prior generation or in prior decades might have been institutionalized, might have had lived in short, what we used to call an insane asylum. But instead, today, they're all living on our streets. And David has been to these streets. He's talked to these people. And you've brought back the idea, maybe we need to consider, right, David, that these are outdoor insane asylums. And maybe it's more humane to go back to what we had in the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point that I really tried to make in the column, and that I think Trump's executive order hits, is that the status quo is so incredibly awful that we need to change what we're doing. And we can't just leave these people on the streets. You know, I described a little on the show, like when you physically go to these places, it's just it's horrifying. And what we're doing now isn't working. And well, it's not because we're not spending money on it, right? Gavin Newsom spent $20 billion to not fix the homeless problem in California. Bill de Blasio, when he was mayor of New York, put his wife in charge of something called Thrive NYC that got $1 billion, 200 million of which are just gone, right? Nobody knows where it went. And clearly the problem has not been significantly helped in spite of that $1 billion. So we need buy-in from the entire industry that exists to help the homeless, to move this out again of these open air institutions into a place where people can get much more guided treatment.
Now, the challenge, though, David, and I do have some personal experience with this in my life, is that the people that would need to be in these types of institutions don't want to be in these types of institutions. So what you've been talking about is involuntary commitment. Mm-hmm. And we did away with that largely in most states across this country some half a century ago. And there's horror stories to be told about why that happened. It's husbands having wives committed. It's homosexuals against their will being committed. It was whatever manner at the time that medical doctors were willing to diagnose as a mental illness could get someone involuntary committed to one of these facilities. And they made movies about it, like Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And then in many cases, they talked about the horrible things that happen inside these institutions. So I don't think any freedom-loving American loves the idea of someone in their family or someone who has the power over them to take away their freedom and then commit them to an institution. But we can simply look at the stats, and they're quite obvious. The correlation is almost spot on. Decline of the institutions, the rise in homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, we can't be paralyzed by the past, right? This happens to us on sort of like issue after issue. It's not 1950, right? We're not going to send people to insane asylums for being gay. And we can't be handcuffed by the foolishness and bigotry of 75 or 100 years ago when we're implementing policies to help people today. We do this around questions of race as well, where like we just sort of pretend that nothing has changed since Jim Crow when it's obviously abject nonsense, right? And so I think we need to sort of disabuse ourselves of the idea that the institution can only look like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is probably an outlier, like even at its own time. This is a basic function of government, right? Like I'm reading a history of London right now, and in like 1137, when it's starting to really become a big city, they created a mental asylum because they had to, because you can't have crazy people roaming the streets. I mean, they understood this in the Middle Ages, and as you say, up until about 50 years ago, we made the wrong choice and we should go back.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I'm sure there is some policy. I'd like to think there is some policy where we would be able to craft protections for some people's freedom while saving some people from these situations they have on the streets. I mentioned that David has two columns up. The other one that caught my attention is more recent, and that is that David makes the argument that we should not only bring back the Washington Redskins, something that President Trump has suggested and pushed towards, but that we should revisit everything that we canceled in 2020. And the line, as you talked about in your column, of bringing back Confederate monuments and so forth, including the monument of Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves that stood in Boston. The line that caught my attention, David, was bring them back, and then we can have an open and honest debate about what should and should not be celebrated, embraced, or remembered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on the record, I've always been against taking down the Confederate statues from the very beginning. I wouldn't say Trump was against it, but go back to 2018, and there were really two arguments. One was Trump, and one was the argument that I had. In 2018, when they started taking down the Confederate statues, Donald Trump said, well, I can kind of understand this, but Jefferson owned slaves, so are we going to start taking down statues of Thomas Jefferson? And MSNBC and everybody said, that's ridiculous. Of course, that would never happen. Well, it took 2 years, Will. And in 2020, they took down a statue of Thomas Jefferson in New York City's City Hall. So that's all it took was 2 years. So that's a slippery slope argument. To me, the more compelling argument is 75 years ago, these people who came before us created a piece of public art because this is what they decided to be remembered for. In the case of that statue in Boston, it was literally freed slaves who paid for it. But a bunch of wokesters in 2020 were like, we don't like the design. We're going to take down the statue that was paid for by the freed slaves, right? So like the Taliban, we're making this decision, not just for ourselves, but for the rest of human history. Nobody gets to see the Teddy Roosevelt statue in New York City. Nobody gets to see the Lincoln statue in Boston. To me, that is intergalactic hubris and not something we should ever get involved in.
What do you think that debate looks like, though? There's that conversation you suggest we could have about what we do or do not. And there's even a conversation about what is the purpose of a statue or anything. Is it to remember? Is it to honor? Is it to celebrate? I just can't imagine what that public conversation would be like on every single one of these statutes or team names or flags.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would be open to the concept. In fact, years ago, I wrote, when this was all going on in 2020, I wrote a column in the Post in regard to New York Post in regard to the Teddy Roosevelt statue, where I said, have a referendum, right? If this statue is such a big problem and everybody's offended and they don't want to see it, put it on the ballot, right? They won't do that because that's not who's making these decisions. These decisions are being made by little city council appointed committees of far left academics. And so it's not reflective of what the average person thinks. Polling never supported taking down the Confederate statues. Polling never supported changing the name of the Washington Redskins. It was just a bunch of, cultural elites who decided that they didn't like it.
That's a good point. I would love to see a popular vote on. Honestly, I'd like to see a popular vote on each and every one of these controversial
good
statutes.
news, but good news
All right,
today,
before
Will.
we go,
Just if I can say, there was reporting today that the National Park Service is restoring the statue of Confederate General Albert Pike in D.C., which was torn down by vandals. So that's a win, right? I mean, the stuff that got torn down by vandals, that should be a no-brainer. That has to go back up. So this is a win. This is a really positive thing to see.
the story of America. All right, before we go, let's go over to the Will issue. Has the following to say here. Marlene says, Will's face looks much more natural on YouTube than the Fox clip. Too much makeup there. Well, thank you, Marlene. It's true I'm not wearing any makeup here on Will Cain Country. I don't think I wear a lot over on the TV show. I would tell you, everyone that accuses me of dyeing my hair or whatever it may be with my face or makeup, I will tell you, never, never underestimate the power of lighting. I'm telling you, I've learned this. Lighting changes everything. Remember that, by the way, when you're taking a selfie. Basic Bob says, strange hand movements are distracting. Yes, I know, Basic Bob. I know. And in Sunshine, Moto says, if they can bring the victim back with AI, then bring back the founding fathers to explain the Second Amendment. Shall not be infringed. Well, that's pretty interesting. Although I wouldn't trust it, David. I wouldn't trust an AI version. Yeah, I wouldn't trust an AI version of James Madison or Alexander Hamilton or any of the authors of the Federalist Papers because, remember, it's only a synthesis of the consensus. So whoever's putting together the AI could really manipulate those founding fathers to make it say whatever they want.
They would start singing numbers from the musical.
That's right. Next thing you know, it would be Lin-Manuel Miranda's version of Alexander Hamilton that gets you your opinion on the real Hamilton. Check out David Marcus's columns at foxnews.com. We've covered two of them here today because they are excellent, and I don't think you should miss them over at foxnews.com. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Will. And Micah Parsons going to look great in green. It's really going to bring his eyes out.
He was always an Eagles fan.